On a chilly morning in February 2018, a young mother named Dorian held two newborn boys in her arms. Both shared the same birthday, the same family, and the same love-filled home, but their appearances could not have been more different. One little boy, Zachary, carried the rich brown complexion of his African-American parents, while his twin brother, Zavit, surprised everyone with snow-white skin and golden hair. Zavit was born with a rare genetic condition known as albinism, which affects the pigment of the skin, hair, and eyes. From the very beginning, the contrast between the boys drew attention. Some people looked with wonder, marveling at the uniqueness of life. But others, unfortunately, responded with suspicion or judgment. When Dorian pushed the stroller through the park or went grocery shopping, she often faced uncomfortable stares and invasive questions. Strangers would ask if both children were hers, or even suggest that Zavit must have been adopted. For a mother, those words carried a sting, because she knew her bond with both children was equal and unshakable. Over time, these experiences became more than just awkward encounters. They revealed how society often struggles to accept what doesn't fit neatly into expected boxes. Dorian noticed how people treated her boys differently, simply because of the shade of their skin. She spoke openly about these challenges, not to gain sympathy, but to raise awareness. She wanted the world to understand that albinism is not something strange or unnatural, it's just another expression of human diversity. Despite the negativity, Dorian refused to let fear or prejudice define her children's lives. She celebrated their differences and raised them to see their uniqueness as a gift. She often reminded them that what matters most is not how others see you, but how you see yourself. In family photos, Zavit's bright golden hair shines beside his brother's dark curls, and together they form a picture of unity, resilience, and love. The story of these twins is not only about biology, it's about the way society reacts to difference. It's about a mother's courage to protect her children from hurtful words while teaching them to be proud of who they are. And it's a reminder for all of us, love doesn't come in just one color. It thrives in diversity, in acceptance, and in the courage to stand against ignorance. As you continue watching, you'll discover more extraordinary stories of rare twins from around the world, each one offering its own powerful lesson about identity and connection. If you find inspiration in stories like this, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and join our growing community. Together, we can celebrate the beauty of difference and the strength of family. In 2015, a simple photograph changed everything for a pair of young girls from Philadelphia. Their mother, Stephanie Boyd, had taken countless snapshots of her daughters, but one image in particular would spark a wave of fascination across the internet. When she shared it online, the world couldn't look away. The girls, Megan and Morgan, had always been captivating. They were identical in their lively energy, their playful laughter, and the way they lit up every room they entered. Yet, there was something about their eyes that set them apart from everyone else, and even from each other. Megan had two striking blue eyes, as clear and bright as a summer sky. Morgan's gaze, however, told an even rarer story. One eye mirrored her sister's shimmering blue, while the other was a deep, warm brown, as rich as polished wood. It was a detail that couldn't be overlooked, a feature that captured hearts instantly. Friends and family had always noticed, of course. Neighbors would stop in their tracks when the girls passed by, curious about their dazzling eyes. But on social media, the fascination grew into something bigger. Within days, the photograph Stephanie posted was being shared far beyond Philadelphia. People across the globe marveled at the True Blue Twins, a nickname quickly adopted by those who followed their story. The more people saw of Megan and Morgan, the more enchanted they became. Their mother began sharing little glimpses of their everyday lives, birthday parties filled with balloons, silly dances in the living room, afternoons spent giggling in matching outfits. With every post, their following grew. The twins weren't simply admired for their rare eye colors, they were adored for their joyful spirits and the bond they shared. What made their eyes so unique wasn't just random chance. Their family history told part of the tale. Stephanie herself had blue eyes, inherited from her father, and other relatives carried similarly striking traits. In fact, within their extended family, heterochromia, the condition that gave Morgan two different colored eyes, was not entirely unheard of. Still, no one in recent memory had displayed it with the same brilliance as these twins. Their gaze seemed to hold two worlds at once, as if reflecting both sides of their heritage and all the beauty of their lineage. Yet their story is about more than genetics. It's about how difference, when embraced, can become a source of strength and pride. The internet can sometimes be unkind, but Meghan and Morgan's presence online was met largely with celebration. Thousands of people commented on their photos with admiration and encouragement, calling them stunning, beautiful, and unforgettable. For many viewers, the twins became a reminder that true beauty lies in what makes us distinct. As their platform grew, opportunities followed. The twins began appearing in features that highlighted children with extraordinary looks. Photographers wanted to capture their rare eyes, stylists wanted to dress them in vibrant colors that made their gazes shine even brighter. But through it all, Stephanie remained careful. She didn't want her daughters to feel defined only by how they looked. Instead, she emphasized the importance of kindness, humility, and staying grounded. To her, their uniqueness was a blessing, but their character was what mattered most. What is perhaps most remarkable is how naturally the twins navigated the attention. For them, their eyes were simply part of who they were. They didn't wake up thinking of themselves as unusual or different, they woke up thinking about school, friends, and playtime. When people stared, they didn't shrink away. Instead, they smiled, because to them, being sisters meant being proud together. Over the years, their presence has continued to inspire conversations about genetics, diversity, and the countless ways beauty reveals itself. Scientists often explain that heterochromia can result from a distribution of melanin, the pigment that colors our eyes, hair, and skin. In rare cases, it can occur naturally without any medical condition at all. For Meghan and Morgan, it was a natural gift, one that spoke to the wonders of biology. But beyond the science lies the deeper meaning of their story, how one photograph could remind the world to pause and appreciate uniqueness. In a society that often pressures people to fit into narrow definitions of beauty, the true blue twins broke through with something undeniable. They showed that difference isn't something to hide or question, it's something to celebrate. Today, Meghan and Morgan continue to capture hearts not just because of their eyes, but because of their confidence, their joy, and the way they remind us all that beauty wears many faces. Their journey is still unfolding, and countless people around the world watch with curiosity and admiration. When you see their photograph, it's easy to be captivated by the rare sparkle of their gaze. But the true magic lies in what their story teaches, that we each carry something extraordinary, even if it isn't visible at first glance. Sometimes, it just takes a moment of openness to see it. And once you do, it's impossible to forget. In the spring of 1997, a small hospital in Gloucester, England, welcomed two newborn girls into the world. Their arrival was joyful but also left their parents, Donna and Vince, completely astonished. When the nurse first placed the twins in Donna's arms, she noticed something that made her blink twice. One baby had skin as fair as porcelain, a crown of fiery red hair, and eyes as blue as the sky after a storm. The other had a warm, golden-brown complexion, curls as dark as midnight, and eyes that glimmered like polished chestnuts. For a moment, Donna wondered if there had been a mistake. Could both of these babies truly be hers? Yet as the hours passed and the shock settled, she realized that these girls were indeed twins, two lives formed side by side, sharing the same womb, but telling two different stories through their appearance. She named them Lucy and Maria. From the very beginning, the contrast between them attracted attention. Family members visiting the hospital were taken aback. Friends who saw them later couldn't help but ask the same question, are they really twins? And when Donna explained that yes, they were, people often wanted proof. It was difficult for outsiders to accept that genetics could paint such a vivid picture of diversity in a single set of siblings. Growing up, Lucy and Maria were often compared. In school photos, they looked less like sisters and more like best friends from completely different backgrounds. Teachers had to double-check the register to remind themselves that the girls belonged to the same family. At birthday parties, other children's parents would whisper to Donna, asking if the girls were adopted or perhaps half-sisters. Donna always answered patiently, though the constant questions sometimes stung. She knew that her daughter's appearances weren't the full story, what mattered was their bond. What made their difference possible lay in the complexity of genetics. Donna carried genes from her white British heritage, while Vince carried genes from his Jamaican roots. When Lucy and Maria were conceived, each inherited a unique blend of these traits. By chance, Lucy received more of her mother's lighter genes, while Maria carried more of her father's darker ones. The result was a striking example of how nature works in mysterious, unpredictable ways. Despite looking so different, the girls grew up inseparable. They wore matching clothes when they were little, and often insisted on sitting together in class. Their personalities complemented each other beautifully. Lucy was calm, thoughtful, and a little shy, while Maria was energetic, social, and fearless. Together, they balanced each other in a way only close siblings can. Their differences in appearance seemed to vanish when they were side by side, giggling over a shared secret or walking home from school arm in arm. Still, the outside world didn't always see past the contrast. As they got older, Lucy and Maria sometimes had to defend their identity as twins. Friends who doubted them would demand to see their birth certificates. Strangers in shops would ask intrusive questions. At times, Lucy admitted she felt overshadowed by the fascination surrounding their story, while Maria sometimes grew frustrated with the disbelief they encountered. But through it all, they leaned on each other. Their sisterhood became a shield, protecting them from the doubts of others. When they reached their teenage years, the story of their uniqueness began to spread beyond their community. Newspapers wrote about them as the twins who looked nothing alike, and their photographs captured attention far beyond the UK. People were fascinated not just by their appearances, but by what they represented, the beautiful complexity of mixed heritage. Lucy and Maria became symbols of how identity cannot be neatly boxed or defined by a single shade of skin. Their family life was filled with the same ups and downs as any other. They bickered over clothes, laughed over inside jokes, and supported each other through challenges. Their mother often reminded them that their appearance was only one part of who they were. "It's your kindness, your courage, and your bond as sisters that people should notice most," she would say. Looking back, Lucy and Maria have both spoken about their experiences with a sense of pride. They understand now that their story is more than just a curiosity, it's a lesson. It shows how two people can share the same origin yet appear so different, and how beauty wears many faces within a single family. Today, when people ask them if they're really twins, Lucy and Maria smile. They've answered the question countless times, but now, instead of frustration, they see it as an opportunity. It's a chance to share their journey and remind the world that family isn't defined by looking alike. It's defined by love, by the memories you build together, and by the unbreakable ties that connect you. Their story continues to inspire others, particularly families of mixed heritage who see themselves reflected in the twins. Lucy and Maria stand as living proof that genetics is not about uniformity, it's about variety, surprise, and the wonder of difference. And for all the questions they've faced over the years, one truth has always remained unshaken: they are, and will always be, sisters in every sense of the word. In a quiet maternity ward in 2016, a young couple welcomed not one, but two tiny miracles into the world. As the nurse placed the babies in their mother's arms, she noticed something that took her breath away. Both girls were beautiful, yet they each carried a unique reflection of their family's heritage. One baby had a warm, golden-brown complexion, her features soft and delicate, while her sister's skin was noticeably lighter, with subtle tones that contrasted yet complemented her twin. Side by side, they looked like two shades from the same palette, distinct yet harmonious. Their parents named them Isabella and Gabriella, and from the very beginning, the world seemed captivated by their presence. Friends and family marveled at the way these sisters could look so different and yet share the same unmistakable bond. People often leaned in close, whispering in awe, "They're twins." And when the answer was yes, the reactions ranged from surprise to wonder. At home, the contrast in their skin tones was never a source of confusion or comparison. To their parents, the girls were simply their daughters, two halves of a whole, bringing twice the joy and double the sleepless nights. But as photos of the babies began to circulate online, something unexpected happened. Their images spread quickly, reaching audiences far beyond their neighborhood. People from around the world commented on how striking they looked, how they represented beauty in its many forms, and how their existence reminded us of the diversity within every community. The attention grew, not because the girls were a novelty, but because they challenged the narrow definitions of what siblings are supposed to look like. For many families of African American heritage, their story resonated deeply. Parents saw Isabella and Gabriella as symbols of the range of beauty within their culture, a reminder that skin tone could vary widely, even within the same household. In a society that often tries to categorize or compare, these little girls stood as proof that identity is far richer than appearances alone. As they grew older, Isabella and Gabriella's personalities began to shine as brightly as their looks. Isabella was playful and curious, always eager to explore the world around her, while Gabriella was thoughtful and calm, often content to observe before joining in. Their differences in temperament mirrored their outward contrasts, but together they balanced each other perfectly. One brought energy, the other steadiness, and both filled their home with laughter. Photographers and media outlets soon reached out, eager to feature the twins in stories and photo projects. Their parents agreed, but only on their own terms. They wanted the girls' images to be celebrated respectfully, not as a spectacle, but as a way to honor the beauty of diversity. Through carefully chosen opportunities, Isabella and Gabriella became tiny ambassadors of a message far bigger than themselves, that beauty, even within the same family, comes in countless shades. Strangers who came across their story often shared personal reflections. Some wrote about their own children, whose skin tones or features didn't match in the way society expected. Others spoke of growing up in families where siblings looked completely different, yet were bound together by love. Isabella and Gabriella's story gave these voices a space to be heard, a gentle reminder that family resemblance is about far more than physical similarity. Within their home, life continued in the ordinary, wonderful chaos of raising twins. There were giggles and tantrums, first steps and bedtime stories. Their parents often dressed them in coordinated outfits, not to emphasize their twin status, but to celebrate their bond. They loved to capture photographs of the girls holding hands, their skin tones forming a soft, striking contrast that highlighted their connection even more. As Isabella and Gabriella's story spread, their parents made sure to keep one thing constant, teaching them to love themselves exactly as they are. Whether their skin was light or dark, whether the world commented or questioned, the girls grew up surrounded by affirmation. "You are both beautiful," their mother would whisper each night before bed. "Not because of how you look, but because of who you are." In time, Isabella and Gabriella came to symbolize something profound. They weren't just celebrated as adorable twins with distinct appearances. They represented the power of diversity within Black identity, the richness of heritage, and the truth that beauty doesn't conform to one standard. Their story became a living reminder that differences should never divide us, they should inspire us to embrace the full spectrum of human experience. And so, these two sisters continue to grow, each with her own personality, her own journey, and her own shade of beauty. Yet together, they form a portrait of love, resilience, and unity. Their story reminds us all of a simple but powerful truth: no matter what we look like on the outside, the bonds of family and the depth of love are what truly define us. In the bustling city of São Paulo, Brazil, a quiet story of resilience and beauty began when twin girls were born into a humble family. From the moment they arrived, it was clear they were unlike most children around them. Their skin was pale, their hair white as snow, and their eyes carried a delicate light blue hue. Doctors explained that the girls had albinism, a condition caused by a lack of pigment in the skin, hair, and eyes. Their parents, though initially surprised, embraced them wholeheartedly, naming them Laura and Mara. Growing up, the twins often found themselves under the gaze of strangers. In a country known for its vibrant spectrum of skin tones and cultural diversity, Laura and Mara's appearance stood out dramatically. Some people reacted with curiosity, others with ignorance, but the girls quickly learned that the world would always have opinions about how they looked. Their parents, however, worked hard to remind them that their uniqueness was a gift, not a flaw. At home, they were simply cherished daughters, encouraged to dream without limits. Childhood wasn't always easy. In school, they sometimes faced questions that felt intrusive, or comments that made them uncomfortable. Yet Laura and Mara had each other. Their bond as twins created a shield against the outside world. If one felt hurt by a careless remark, the other would step in with comfort and support. They developed a confidence rooted not in fitting in, but in standing tall together. As teenagers, their lives took an unexpected turn. One afternoon, during a local event, a photographer noticed the twins walking with their family. Captivated by their striking appearance, he asked if he could take their portraits. Those photographs, shared online, began to circulate rapidly. Suddenly, Laura and Mara were introduced to the world not as girls who were different, but as symbols of beauty in its rarest form. Fashion scouts reached out, intrigued by their look, and before long the sisters found themselves stepping into the world of modeling. Their first shoots were modest, but even in simple settings, the camera loved them. Against colorful backdrops, their pale skin and white hair created a visual contrast that felt almost ethereal. They embodied something that fashion constantly seeks but rarely finds: authenticity combined with originality. The industry, often criticized for promoting narrow definitions of beauty, suddenly had before it two young women who broke every mold. Opportunities grew. Laura and Mara began to appear in campaigns for Brazilian designers who celebrated diversity. They walked runways that had once seemed like distant dreams. Each time they posed, they carried more than just garments, they carried a message. They proved that beauty was not confined to a single standard, but instead existed in the courage to embrace one's true self. International brands soon took notice, inviting the twins to collaborate on projects that reached audiences far beyond Brazil. Magazines featured them not just for their looks, but for the story they represented: resilience, identity, and the redefining of beauty norms. Interviews highlighted their voices, giving them the chance to speak about albinism, about acceptance, and about the importance of representation. Despite the glitz and glamour, the twins remained grounded. They often spoke about their upbringing, about how their parents taught them to see their condition not as a limitation but as part of who they were. They wanted to use their platform to inspire others, especially young people who felt out of place because they looked different. Laura once said, "We don't want to be seen only as models with albinism. We want to be seen as women who show the world that beauty wears many faces." Their story resonated deeply, particularly in communities where albinism is often misunderstood. Messages poured in from around the globe: children with albinism who felt seen for the first time, parents who gained hope for their children's futures, and people who found courage to embrace their own differences. Laura and Mara had become more than fashion models, they were role models. What makes their journey so remarkable is not just the fame they achieved, but the way they used it. For every photo shoot, every runway, every magazine cover, the sisters carried with them a quiet determination, to show the world that what makes us different can also make us extraordinary. In the end, Laura and Mara's lives tell a story far larger than fashion. It's a story about acceptance, resilience, and the unshakable bond between sisters. It's about turning what others might see as a challenge into a platform for change. And above all, it's about embracing the rarest parts of ourselves with pride. From the streets of São Paulo to the runways of international fashion capitals, the twins continue to walk together, two young women who once stood out for their albinism, and now shine for their courage to define beauty on their own terms. In the heart of New Orleans, two little girls grew up side by side, so inseparable that most people assumed they were sisters. Gia, Nia and Zuri first met in kindergarten, and from that moment, their bond was instant, like a spark that needed no explanation. They sat together at lunch, shared crayons during art class, and held hands when walking to the playground. To anyone watching, it seemed as though they had known each other for a lifetime. What made their connection so remarkable was that, in truth, they weren't related at all. They didn't share the same parents, the same bloodline, or even the same household. Yet from the very beginning, Gia and Zuri called each other twin. It wasn't a nickname or a game. It was a declaration of how they felt in their hearts. Their parents noticed the closeness immediately. Gia would come home and talk endlessly about Zuri, and Zuri did the same about Gia. Soon, their families began to intertwine as well. Playdates turned into sleepovers, birthdays were celebrated together, and holidays often included both households. Before long, it was hard to tell where one family ended and the other began. At school, their bond only deepened. They dressed alike whenever they could, sometimes in matching bows, sometimes in identical sneakers. Teachers laughed when they insisted on being seated side by side, explaining that they couldn't concentrate unless they were near each other. Their classmates quickly learned that questioning their twinship was pointless. Gia and Zuri were twins in their own right, and no one could convince them otherwise. What made their story even more powerful was the way they supported one another. When one felt nervous before a test, the other offered comfort. When one faced teasing on the playground, the other stood fiercely by her side. They seemed to share an unspoken language, a rhythm of understanding that needed no words. Their connection wasn't about appearance, but about spirit. Over time, their twin identity became something celebrated, not just within their circle, but in their community. Their families embraced it wholeheartedly, often referring to the girls as the twins without hesitation. Photographs of them together captured the joy of childhood companionship, the kind of pure, unshakable bond that many people spend a lifetime searching for. As they grew older, Gia and Zuri began to realize that what they shared carried a lesson bigger than themselves. Not all families are defined by DNA. Some are formed by choice, by love, and by the kind of connection that defies explanation. Their story became a reminder that what truly makes someone your family is not blood, but the unwavering devotion you give to one another. Even now, as young women, Gia and Zuri still proudly call themselves twins. They laugh about how people used to question them, but in their eyes, there was never a question to begin with. They know that family can be chosen, that love can make sisters out of friends, and that sometimes the deepest bonds come from the heart, not from genetics. Their journey shows us something profound. Being a twin isn't only about being born together, it's about living life together, side by side, through every joy and every challenge. And in that sense, Gia and Zuri will always be twins, no matter what the world says. In the vast world of twins, there are stories so unusual that they leave people stunned, questioning how such things can even be possible. Some twins share a bond so extraordinary that their story goes far beyond genetics, reminding us that life has a way of rewriting the rules. Among these rare cases are three very different sets of twins, each carrying a tale that fascinates, inspires, and challenges what we think we know about family and identity. Take Ruth and Kitty, two sisters who entered the fashion industry not just as models, but as innovators. At first glance, their photographs seem almost surreal. In one of their most famous shoots, the twins posed so perfectly in sync that they appeared to share a single body. It was an illusion, crafted through meticulous posing and styling, but the effect was breathtaking. Audiences couldn't look away. Their creativity blurred the line between reality and imagination, making people question what they were seeing. Unlike traditional modeling, Ruth and Kitty turned their twinship into a form of visual art. They used their identical looks as a canvas, creating scenes that played with perception, symmetry, and unity. What made them unforgettable was not just their beauty, but their ability to reinvent what it meant to be twins in the public eye. Then there is the incredible story of Cohen and Teun, twins from the Netherlands whose very existence defied medical expectations. Born through IVF, their journey began in a laboratory where, due to a rare mix-up, two different sperm samples fertilized separate eggs at the same time. This meant that the twins, though born together, had two different fathers. The discovery shocked both the family and the doctors involved. Genetic testing later confirmed what seemed impossible: one twin was biologically connected to the father who had intended to conceive, while the other carried the DNA of a stranger. And yet, under Dutch law and in the hearts of their parents, both boys were equally loved and embraced as part of the same family. Their story demonstrates how unpredictable life can be, and how love, not just science, defines parenthood. And then, there are Marcia and Millie, twin sisters from the UK who became living symbols of genetic wonder. When they were born, no one could have predicted how different they would look as they grew. Marcia had light hair, fair skin, and blue eyes, while Millie had darker skin, brown curls, and warm brown eyes. Side by side, they appeared not just as siblings, but as a striking representation of their parents' combined heritage, one white, one of Jamaican descent. Strangers often doubted that they were even related, let alone twins. Their parents grew used to explaining the science behind it. Non-identical twins inherit different combinations of genes, and in this case, the girls inherited opposite traits. What could have been a source of division instead became a celebration of diversity within one family. Marcia and Millie themselves embraced their differences, showing the world that identity is multifaceted, and that true sisterhood goes far beyond appearances. These stories may seem like anomalies, but they reveal something deeper about the human experience. Ruth and Kitty show us that being twins can be an art form, a way of reimagining identity and unity. Cohen and Tuin remind us that even the most extraordinary circumstances cannot undo the love of a family. And Marcia and Millie stand as a testament to the beauty of difference, proving that shared DNA can produce a spectrum of individuality. When we look at these rare cases, we see more than just genetics at play. We see creativity, resilience, and acceptance. We see how families adapt, how society reacts, and how individuals choose to define themselves. Most of all, we see that twins, no matter how unusual their stories, teach us lessons about life itself, that identity is complex, that love is unconditional, and that difference is something to be celebrated, not questioned. In the end, these extraordinary pairs remind us that there is no single way to be a twin. Some share mirrored faces, some share no physical resemblance at all, and some, like Cohen and Tuin, don't even share the same father. But in every case, their stories capture the imagination and open our eyes to the limitless possibilities of human connection. In the early 1960s, in a small corner of Wales, two little girls named June and Jennifer were born into a family that could not have imagined the extraordinary path their lives would take. From the very beginning, the sisters shared a connection so intense that it seemed to shut the rest of the world out. As children, they spoke in whispers, not in English or in any language others could understand, but in a private code of their own making. To teachers and classmates, they appeared distant, even unreachable. To each other, however, they were everything, two halves of a secret world. This bond, though beautiful in its uniqueness, also became their prison. Their silence set them apart from others, leading to isolation. Teachers tried to break through, therapists attempted to coax them into speaking, and even drastic measures were taken, sending them to separate schools in hopes that distance might push them toward independence. Instead, the opposite happened. Separated, the girls withdrew further into themselves, refusing to eat, speak, or participate in daily life. Their connection was not just emotional, it was survival. Without each other, they faded. When reunited, June and Jennifer retreated deeper into their shared universe. They filled notebooks with stories, poetry, and plays. These weren't simple children's tales, they were vivid, often dark narratives of young people wrestling with power, betrayal, and tragedy. The twins poured their emotions into writing, transforming silence into creativity. Their words became their voice, and through them, the world could finally glimpse the depths of their imagination. Yet even as their stories blossomed, their reality remained troubled. Their refusal to fully engage with the outside world led to challenges that weighed heavily on them and their family. The sisters longed to break free but were also terrified of living without each other. It was a paradox that defined their existence, wanting individuality, but fearing separation. As time went on, June and Jennifer's lives became a haunting tale of love, dependence, and the cost of a bond too strong for the world to understand. They were called the silent twins, but in truth, they were never silent at all. Their voices were simply hidden in the pages of their journals, in the worlds they created together, and in the language only they could speak. Today, their legacy continues to capture imaginations around the world. Their story is not just about silence, but about the complexity of identity, the intensity of human bonds, and the struggle to find one's voice. It reminds us that sometimes, the deepest connections defy explanation. And sometimes, the greatest truths are written not with words spoken aloud, but with words poured onto a page in solitude. As we close this chapter, the tale of June and Jennifer leaves us with a profound reflection. Family ties can be both a sanctuary and a storm, and finding balance between love and independence is one of life's most delicate challenges. Their story, though bittersweet, reminds us of the resilience of the human spirit and the many ways we search for meaning in a world that often misunderstands us. If you found this journey through the lives of rare and extraordinary twins inspiring, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and join our community as we share more stories that celebrate the wonders and complexities of life. Thank you for watching, and until next time, may your night be peaceful and your dreams be kind. Good night. Imagine standing on the edge of the West African coast in the early 1500s, gazing out at the horizon where the sun meets the endless ocean. Villages were alive with music, the clang of blacksmiths at their forges, the laughter of children, and the wisdom of elders. Life was filled with stories, traditions, and rich cultures that had thrived for centuries. Yet, over the next 300 years, an unimaginable journey would unfold, one that would reshape not only Africa but the entire world. From 1500 to 1880, millions of men, women, and children were forced from these lands and carried across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas. Historians estimate the number to be between 10 and 12 million. The journey they endured is remembered today as one of the most difficult passages in human history, and it came with a terrible cost. Nearly 15% of those who began the voyage never reached the other side. Picture the vast ships that cut through the waves, designed not for comfort but for human transport. Inside, space was scarce, air was heavy, and the sound of the ocean was mixed with the cries of people longing for home. This voyage, known as the Middle Passage, lasted weeks, sometimes months, depending on the winds and storms. Each day was a battle to survive. For those who endured, life on new shores would bring challenges that tested their humanity and their resilience. This is not just a story of suffering. It is also a story of strength, survival, and the unbreakable spirit of people who carried with them songs, beliefs, and traditions. These stories became the foundation of communities that still live on today. When we look back, we are not only remembering hardship, we are honoring resilience and courage. In this video, we will journey together through a history that is often overlooked or simplified in classrooms. We will uncover what really happened, explore the voices that refuse to be silenced, and connect the past to the world we live in now. Understanding this history is not about dwelling on pain but about recognizing the depth of human endurance and the power of memory. If this is your first time here, I invite you to join our community. Hit the like button, share this video with someone who needs to hear these stories, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next chapter. Together, we'll continue to explore the truths that history books often leave behind, and ensure that the voices of the past are never forgotten. In the early 1500s, when European ships first anchored along the coasts of the Americas, their captains believed they had discovered lands overflowing with wealth and endless opportunity. The soil was fertile, the climate allowed for year-round crops, and there were vast forests and rivers that promised abundance. For these colonizers, the only missing piece was labor, hands strong enough to cultivate sugar, tobacco, coffee, and cotton on a scale large enough to satisfy the growing appetites of Europe. At first, They turned to the people who had lived on these lands for countless generations, the indigenous nations whose history stretched back long before the first European sails appeared on the horizon. These were skilled farmers, hunters, and builders who understood the land in ways no outsider could. Colonizers believed they could simply force this knowledge into their service. Indigenous men and women were captured and compelled to work in fields, in mines, and on construction projects that expanded European settlements. But the colonizers had underestimated both the strength of the people and the fragility of their own plan. Indigenous nations resisted fiercely, defending their homelands with courage and determination. Yet even where force succeeded temporarily, another threat loomed larger: disease. Smallpox, measles, and influenza, illnesses carried unknowingly across the ocean, swept through villages and communities. Within a generation, whole populations declined at devastating rates. The colonizers saw their labor force collapsing before their eyes. The violence of conquest added to the devastation. Entire regions were caught in cycles of raids, battles, and reprisals. For the indigenous people, this period was one of profound disruption. Traditional ways of life were uprooted, families were torn apart, and the balance that had sustained their societies was shattered. And still, despite these hardships, resistance remained strong. Many escaped into forests and mountains, finding refuge and rebuilding where they could. Others fought openly, refusing to submit to a system designed to erase their independence. For European colonizers, however, the question remained: how could they build their plantations and mines without a stable supply of labor? The answer, they decided, lay across the Atlantic. Africa was not unfamiliar to them. Portuguese and Spanish ships had already begun sailing along its coasts, trading goods, mapping territories, and establishing footholds. What began as exploration quickly evolved into something more sinister. Africa was home to thriving kingdoms and empires, places where art, trade, and scholarship flourished. Cities bustled with merchants exchanging salt, gold, ivory, and textiles. There were systems of governance, spiritual traditions, and networks of trade stretching deep into the continent. Yet to European eyes focused on profit, these lands became a solution to their labor crisis in the Americas. Unlike the indigenous people of the New World, Africans had already developed immunities to many of the diseases brought from Europe, simply because of centuries of contact through trade and migration. Colonizers calculated that this would make Africans better suited for the brutal work demanded on plantations. They also saw in Africa a system of internal conflicts, rivalries, and wars that they could exploit. Some local rulers and traders, drawn by European goods like firearms, textiles, and alcohol, became partners in this new commerce of human lives. The decision to turn toward Africa was not made from a place of necessity alone, it was also driven by greed. The more the colonies grew, the more Europe demanded crops like sugar and tobacco. These commodities were shaping the economy of the entire continent. Plantations became engines of wealth, and colonizers sought a labor force that seemed endless. Africa, with its vast population, was seen not as a continent of equal civilizations but as a reservoir of human beings who could be uprooted and sold. This shift marked the beginning of one of history's most infamous systems of exploitation, the transatlantic trade. What started with the failure to enslave indigenous nations became the justification for building a global network of forced labor that would endure for centuries. Millions of Africans were captured, marched to coastal forts, and placed aboard ships bound for foreign lands they had never imagined. The legacy of this decision is profound. It meant that the Americas would be shaped not only by the cultures of Europe and the surviving indigenous nations but also by the resilience, traditions, and knowledge carried by Africans. Though forced under unimaginable circumstances, those who survived brought with them languages, music, farming practices, and spiritual beliefs that would endure and evolve in the New World. When we trace this turning point, the moment when Europeans looked away from the people of the Americas and turned their gaze toward Africa, we uncover more than just a shift in labor supply. We see the roots of a global system that valued profit over humanity, and the beginning of a story that still echoes in today's struggles for equality and justice. This was not a simple substitution of one labor source for another. It was the start of centuries of cultural transformation, loss, resistance, and survival. And to truly understand the Americas as they exist today, we must look back to that moment, when the failure of one plan set into motion the creation of another, one that would forever link three continents through both suffering and strength. Before the ships, before the chains, before the long journeys across the ocean, those who would later be forced into captivity were not faceless figures. They were people with names, voices, and places in their communities. They were fathers teaching their sons to fish in rivers that had sustained their families for generations. They were mothers passing down songs that carried the wisdom of centuries. They were artisans whose hands shaped iron, carved wood, and wove cloth that told stories of their culture. They were farmers who knew the rhythms of the seasons, soldiers who defended their villages, and children whose laughter echoed in marketplaces and courtyards. Life in many African societies was rich and complex, grounded in tradition yet always moving forward. Families gathered under the shade of trees to share meals. Elders told stories of ancestors and gods, blending memory with myth. In bustling towns, merchants traded salt, spices, and gold across vast networks that stretched from the Sahara to the coast. Across the continent, people built kingdoms, forged alliances, and cultivated identities tied deeply to land, lineage, and belief. When outsiders arrived with ships and weapons, they did not see these people for who they were. They saw only labor to be exploited. Villages were raided, wars fueled by foreign demand, and human beings taken from the homes and communities that gave them meaning. The act was not just physical capture, it was the tearing away of identity. A farmer who once walked proudly through fields of millet or yams would now be seen only as a tool for foreign plantations. An artisan whose skill had been celebrated in markets would have their craft silenced. A soldier once respected in battle would be stripped of weapons and reduced to servitude. Imagine the confusion and grief of those moments. One day you are part of a community where your role is defined and respected. The next, you are shackled, forced onto ships, and treated as though your life's experiences, your culture, and your humanity no longer matter. Yet the truth is that those identities never disappeared. They were suppressed, buried under the weight of oppression, but not destroyed. On the ships crossing the Atlantic, whispers of old songs could still be heard. Survivors carried fragments of their traditions with them, rhythms tapped on wooden planks, prayers spoken softly in native tongues, memories of dances, recipes, and ceremonies. These fragments became lifelines, small acts of defiance against a system that sought to erase individuality. In the Americas, those who endured did not abandon their humanity. They built families again, even under conditions that tried to tear them apart. They shared knowledge of farming techniques that transformed plantations. They brought with them cooking methods, spiritual practices, and storytelling traditions that blended with indigenous and European influences to create entirely new cultures. The drumbeats of Africa echoed in Caribbean music. The flavors of African kitchens appeared in southern dishes. The strength of African beliefs intertwined with Christianity to form new expressions of faith. Each of these contributions reminds us of an important truth: those who were captured were never just laborers. They were carriers of knowledge, builders of community, and preservers of heritage. The world we know today, its music, its cuisine, its languages, its art, bears the imprint of their survival and creativity. But beyond cultural influence lies a deeper, more personal story. Every individual taken had a life before. They had dreams, loves, and responsibilities. To reduce them to the label of slave is to accept the erasure that the system intended. To honor them fully is to restore their identities as people who once stood proudly as farmers, artisans, soldiers, and family members. People whose dignity was challenged but whose humanity could never be erased. Their story is not only one of tragedy but of resilience. Despite being uprooted and stripped of everything familiar, they found ways to rebuild, resist, and endure. The legacy of their survival is seen not just in history books but in the lives of their descendants, who continue to honor their strength by thriving in a world shaped by their ancestors' courage. So when we reflect on this history, we must look past the label imposed upon them. We must imagine the vibrant communities they came from, the skills they carried, and the identities they fought to preserve. Only then can we begin to grasp the depth of their humanity and the magnitude of what was taken. And only then can we truly honor the resilience of people whose heritage was never truly lost. It lives on, carried forward in the stories, cultures, and generations that followed. Across the vast Atlantic Ocean, a system of exchange emerged that would shape the course of history for centuries. At first glance, it looked like a simple network of trade, ships leaving Europe, docking on the coasts of Africa, crossing to the Americas, and then sailing home again. But behind this cycle lay a story far more complex, filled with ambition, exploitation, and the reshaping of entire continents. Imagine the harbors of Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries. Wooden ships lined the docks, their sails billowing, their holds packed with goods. Barrels of rum, crates of textiles, guns, iron tools, and manufactured wares, these were the items loaded onto vessels bound for Africa. To merchants and investors, these were not just goods, they were investments in a profitable system that promised enormous returns. Each voyage was carefully calculated, every cargo chosen with one purpose: to exchange for human lives on the African coast. When the ships arrived in West African ports, negotiations began. Some exchanges were made with local rulers or traders who had been drawn into this global web of commerce. Goods from Europe became bargaining tools, exchanged for captives taken in wars, raids, or through corrupt deals. The coastlines became dotted with forts and trading posts, each one a grim reminder of the growing demand overseas. Once the ships were filled with their human cargo, they embarked on the second leg of the journey, the infamous crossing of the Atlantic. For weeks or even months, the vessels battled storms and currents, carrying their unwilling passengers toward the Americas. This leg of the voyage was the most brutal, a passage that stripped away not only freedom but often life itself. But for the merchants and colonizers, the journey did not end at the water's edge. In the Americas, a new world of wealth was waiting to be built on plantations and in mines. Sugar cane swayed in the Caribbean fields, tobacco leaves dried under the hot sun of Virginia, and cotton bolls covered the southern soil. Coffee, rice, and indigo thrived as well. These raw materials became the backbone of the colonial economy, and the labor that produced them came from the very people who had been uprooted from African homelands. Ships did not return to Europe empty. Their holds were now stacked with barrels of sugar, bundles of tobacco, bales of cotton, commodities that were in high demand. In the drawing rooms of London, Paris, and Lisbon, sugar-sweetened tea, tobacco-filled pipes, and cotton-clothed families. What began in the plantations of the Americas ended as luxuries in European homes, fueling not just personal consumption but entire industries. The cycle was complete, and it soon became known as the triangular trade, a network that tied three continents together in a system of profit and dependence. Behind the polished surfaces of this system, however, were layers of human cost. For every pound of sugar consumed, there were countless hours of backbreaking labor in the Caribbean sun. For every pipe of tobacco smoked in Europe, there was the story of a life uprooted and reshaped. For every yard of cotton spun in a European mill, there were hands in the Americas picking under conditions no one would willingly endure. This triangular exchange did more than fill the coffers of merchants, it transformed societies. In Europe, the profits funded new industries, banks, and institutions that fueled the rise of capitalism. In Africa, communities were destabilized, populations diminished, and conflicts intensified as demand for captives grew. In the Americas, entire landscapes were reshaped into plantations, while new cultures emerged from the blending of African, indigenous, and European traditions. Music, cuisine, language, and spirituality all bore the marks of this forced encounter, creating legacies that remain today. Yet, the story is not only one of suffering and exploitation. It is also one of survival. The people carried across the Atlantic did not lose their humanity, even when systems tried to erase it. They built families, preserved traditions, and found ways to resist and adapt. In the very fields where they were forced to labor, they planted seeds of resilience, songs, beliefs, and practices that would outlast the trade itself. When we look at the triangular trade today, it is tempting to reduce it to a diagram in a history book, arrows pointing from Europe to Africa, Africa to the Americas, and back again. But behind those arrows are human stories, merchants counting profits, rulers making uneasy bargains, captives enduring unimaginable journeys, and laborers shaping the foundations of the modern world. This system of exchange was not just about goods moving across the ocean. It was about lives transformed, cultures reshaped, and continents forever bound together by a cycle that fed on both ambition and suffering. To understand it fully, we must look beyond the trade routes and see the people whose lives turned those arrows into history. The journey across the Atlantic, often called the Middle Passage, was unlike anything most people today can imagine. It was not a voyage of adventure or discovery, it was a forced crossing, endured by millions of Africans who had been torn from their homes and thrust into a world of unimaginable hardship. To step aboard one of these ships was to enter an environment designed not for humanity, but for profit, where every inch of space was calculated to maximize cargo rather than preserve dignity or life. Picture the inside of a wooden vessel built to carry hundreds of people across an ocean. The air below deck was thick, heavy, and suffocating. Men, women, and children were confined in spaces so tight that they could barely sit upright, let alone stretch their limbs. Rows upon rows of bodies lay pressed together, chained at wrists and ankles. Every movement was restricted, every breath shared with dozens of others, the heat and stench rising with each passing hour. Food was scarce, often nothing more than meager portions of beans, rice, or stale bread. Clean water was limited, rationed in small amounts that left many constantly thirsty. Illness spread quickly in such conditions. With little ventilation and no medical care, diseases like dysentery, smallpox, and fevers claimed lives in alarming numbers. What began as a voyage often ended with a quarter of those aboard never reaching the shore. But the physical conditions tell only part of the story. There was also the weight of fear and despair. Imagine the terror of being bound in chains, hearing the cries of others in the darkness, and feeling the ship's motion as it carried you farther and farther from everything you knew. For many, this was the first time seeing the ocean, the first time encountering the massive wooden ships of Europe. To be forced into them, powerless to escape, created a sense of isolation and grief that words struggle to capture. Some resisted, even in such desperate circumstances. Stories survive of uprisings aboard ships, where groups of captives fought back against their captors, sometimes seizing control for brief moments. Others chose to refuse food, a silent act of defiance against the conditions they faced. In response, captains and crew often resorted to brutal measures to maintain control. These acts of resistance, though often crushed, reveal a truth that cannot be erased. Even in the darkest holds of those ships, people did not surrender their humanity. For the crew and merchants, the voyage was about economics. Each person represented profit, a commodity to be sold in distant markets. The cramped conditions, the chains, the lack of care, all were calculated decisions designed to maximize the number of people who could survive just long enough to be sold. It was a cruel arithmetic that valued lives only in terms of labor and return on investment. And yet, despite everything, many endured. Those who survived the Middle Passage carried with them memories of home, fragments of songs, traditions, and languages that would later blend into new cultures in the Americas. The resilience to survive such conditions speaks to a strength beyond measure. Out of despair, they carried forward stories, rhythms, and beliefs that would echo through generations. When we reflect on this journey today, it is not enough to speak of percentages or mortality rates, though historians estimate that as many as 1 in 4 did not survive. Behind every number was a person, a farmer, a child, a healer, a warrior, a parent. Each had a life before the ship, and each endured something that forever reshaped who they were and where they belonged in the world. To step back and imagine these voyages not as statistics but as lived experiences is to see them in their full human dimension. The Middle Passage was more than a route across the ocean. It was a passage through loss, fear, and suffering, but also through resilience, courage, and survival. The legacy of those crossings lingers today. Music, language, food, and traditions in the Americas still carry the imprints of those who endured. Their strength transformed what was meant to be only exploitation into a story also of persistence and continuity. Every time we remember the ships, the cramped quarters, the cries in the dark, we also remember that those who endured were never just cargo. They were human beings whose survival and resilience reshaped the world. When many people think of the transatlantic slave trade, they often picture ships arriving on the shores of what is now the United States. But the truth of history tells a different story, one that stretches far wider across the Americas. Of the millions of Africans forced across the Atlantic, only a small fraction, about 4%, landed directly in North America. The vast majority were taken to the Caribbean islands and to South America, with Brazil becoming the single largest destination. Imagine the bustling ports of Havana, Cartagena, or Salvador de Bahia in the 17th and 18th centuries. Ships arrived regularly, their decks crowded with weary captives who had endured the long Atlantic crossing. Merchants, plantation owners, and colonial officials gathered to inspect the new arrivals, their minds already fixed on the sugar fields, coffee plantations, and mines where labor was desperately needed. These ports were gateways into societies built upon forced labor, where African traditions would collide with European ambitions and indigenous resilience to shape entirely new worlds. Brazil, in particular, absorbed staggering numbers. Its sugar plantations in the northeast demanded constant labor under harsh tropical conditions. The climate and intensity of the work made survival difficult, and plantation owners sought a steady stream of new laborers to replace those who perished. Over centuries, Brazil would receive nearly 5 million Africans, far more than any other colony in the Americas. The impact of this migration was profound, creating a society where African heritage became deeply woven into language, religion, music, and daily life. In the Caribbean, islands like Jamaica, Barbados, and Saint-Domingue, now Haiti, became centers of sugar production. Sugar was called white gold, and European demand seemed insatiable. Fields stretched for miles, and mills ran day and night. To sustain this massive industry, millions of Africans were brought to the islands. The population balance was striking. In many places, Africans and their descendants outnumbered Europeans by 10 to 1. This imbalance gave rise not only to unique cultures but also to powerful movements of resistance, including uprisings that shook colonial powers to their core. Contrast this with North America, where only about 400,000 Africans were brought directly over the course of centuries. While their descendants would go on to play a central role in the nation's history, they represented only a small portion of the transatlantic trade. The difference was not just in numbers, but in conditions. In North America, the climate and farming systems allowed for longer lifespans compared to the brutal conditions of Caribbean plantations. This meant that, over time, the enslaved population grew naturally through family generations, while in the Caribbean and Brazil, the constant demand for new arrivals never ceased. The cultural consequences of these demographic patterns are still visible today. Walk through the streets of Salvador in Brazil, and you will hear the rhythm of drums rooted in West Africa. Visit Havana, and you will see ceremonies blending Catholic saints with Yoruba deities. In Jamaica, reggae and Rastafarian traditions trace their ancestry to African spiritual and musical practices. These regions became living archives of African heritage, preserved and transformed in the Americas. The fact that so many were sent to the Caribbean and South America also reshaped global economies. Sugar from the islands, coffee from Brazil, and other plantation crops flowed into European markets, fueling wealth and industrial growth. These commodities were not only luxuries but also drivers of change, linking distant continents through a cycle of demand and exploitation. And yet, behind the commerce and cultural blending lay untold suffering. Families were separated on the docks, individuals were assigned to plantations where survival was uncertain, and communities were forced to rebuild themselves in unfamiliar lands. The majority who did not reach North America directly nonetheless left an indelible mark on the history of the Western Hemisphere. To understand this, we must expand our vision beyond a single country's narrative. The story of the transatlantic trade is not confined to the plantations of Virginia or the cotton fields of the South. It stretches across Brazil's sugar coast, the gold mines of Minas Gerais, the cane fields of Barbados, and the coffee plantations of Cuba. It is a story of dispersal and survival, of cultures broken apart and then rebuilt across oceans. So when we remember the millions who crossed the Atlantic, let us not limit their story to North America alone. Their greatest numbers, their most enduring cultural legacies, and their fiercest struggles unfolded in the Caribbean and South America. In the music, religions, and traditions of these regions, the voices of the past still speak, reminding us that history was written not in one place, but across an entire hemisphere. On a humid summer night in 1839, off the coast of Cuba, a group of men sat shackled in the hold of a schooner named La Amistad. They were not sailors, nor were they passengers traveling by choice. They were Africans, recently taken from their homeland and forced onto a journey that had already stolen their freedom. For weeks, they had endured confinement, hunger, and uncertainty. But in the silence of the waves, a spark of resolve burned among them, an unshakable belief that their lives were not meant to be defined by chains. Among them was a man named Sengbi P., known later as Joseph Sink. He was not a soldier or a leader by birth, but circumstance called him to both roles. In the suffocating darkness of the ship's hold, he whispered plans to the others. They had been stripped of everything, home, family, dignity, but the one thing no captor could take was their will to fight. That night, armed with makeshift weapons and raw determination, they rose against their oppressors. The revolt was swift and fierce. The captives broke free, overpowered the crew, and killed the captain and cook. Only the navigator, a Spaniard, was spared, as the Africans needed someone to guide the vessel back across the Atlantic, toward Sierra Leone and the lives they longed to reclaim. For the first time since their abduction, the men of the Amistad held their fate in their own hands. But freedom, as history often reminds us, was not so easily won. The navigator deceived them, steering not east toward Africa but north along the American coast. After weeks of drifting, the Amistad was seized by the U.S. Navy near Long Island. The Africans, exhausted yet unbroken, were imprisoned and put on trial. Their future would now be decided not by chains or swords, but by the weight of law and politics. What followed was one of the most remarkable legal battles in American history. The Spanish crown demanded the captives be returned to Cuba, insisting they were legally owned property. The U.S. government, bowing to diplomatic pressure, leaned toward compliance. But abolitionists across the country saw in the Amistad case an opportunity to expose the inhumanity of the slave trade. They rallied public support, raised funds for legal defense, and framed the Africans not as criminals but as men who had resisted an unjust captivity. In the courtroom, the Africans' voices were finally heard. Through interpreters, they recounted their abduction, the brutality they endured, and the desperate courage that led to their uprising. Their testimony revealed not savagery, as detractors claimed, but humanity, fathers longing for children, men yearning for freedom, people refusing to be reduced to commodities. The case eventually reached the U.S. Supreme Court, where an unlikely advocate stepped forward, former President John Quincy Adams. At 73 years old, Adams delivered a passionate argument that echoed through history. He insisted that the Africans were not property but human beings, unjustly kidnapped and fully entitled to resist. His words pierced the heart of the institution that had tried to silence them. In 1841, the Supreme Court delivered its ruling: the Africans of the Amistad were free. They had been taken illegally, and their revolt was an act of self-defense, not rebellion. After years of turmoil, 35 survivors returned to Sierra Leone in 1842, their names etched into the legacy of resistance. The Amistad story became more than a single event, it became a symbol. It demonstrated that even within a world bent on oppression, individuals could rise up and demand justice. It exposed the contradictions of a nation that proclaimed liberty while allowing bondage. And it inspired future generations to continue the fight against systems of exploitation. What makes the Amistad uprising so powerful is not just its outcome in court, but the courage of those who dared to resist in the face of impossible odds. They were not soldiers trained for battle. They were ordinary men, torn from farms and families, who refused to accept that their lives were expendable. Their defiance was not just for themselves, but for countless others who never had the chance to speak. Today, the story of the Amistad still resonates. It reminds us that history is not only shaped by rulers and governments but also by those who rise in moments of great injustice. It is a story of courage, of law meeting morality, and of a truth too powerful to be buried. The waves that once carried the Amistad across the Atlantic also carried the echoes of freedom, echoes that continue to reach us even now. Along the western coast of Africa, centuries ago, trade routes bustled with activity. Salt, gold, ivory, and textiles had long moved between regions, carried by merchants who built networks stretching across deserts and rivers. But when European ships began to anchor offshore in the 15th and 16th centuries, they brought with them new desires, guns, liquor, and manufactured goods. These items held an allure that would change the course of history. The encounters between European traders and African rulers were complex. Some communities resisted foreign intrusion, while others saw opportunity. For powerful kings and war chiefs, the arrival of ships meant a chance to expand influence, strengthen armies, and secure wealth. In return for muskets, metal, and luxury goods, they offered something Europeans increasingly demanded: people. Rivalries between neighboring groups fueled this trade. Captives taken in wars or raids were no longer kept as dependents within villages or absorbed into families, as had sometimes been the custom in earlier African practices of servitude. Instead, these captives were marched to coastal forts and sold to European merchants. The exchange was transactional, yet its consequences were devastating. Imagine a small village at dawn. The quiet is shattered by the sound of armed raiders. Homes are set ablaze, families scattered, and those caught alive are bound together with ropes. The captors, often from rival ethnic groups, march them toward the coast, where stone fortresses stand as grim gateways to the Atlantic. Here, European traders wait with barrels of gunpowder, crates of textiles, or bottles of rum. Each human life is bartered for goods that fuel further cycles of conflict. For African rulers engaged in this trade, the motives were layered. Some sought to eliminate rivals or consolidate power by selling enemies. Others saw it as a way to gain access to European weapons, which in turn allowed them to defend their kingdoms, or dominate others. Over time, entire regional economies began to shift toward this grim exchange. Communities that resisted participation risked being targeted themselves, while those who engaged became entangled in a system that grew ever more destructive. It is tempting to imagine this history as one-sided, with Europeans forcing submission at every turn. The truth is more complicated. Without the cooperation of local leaders and traders, the scale of the transatlantic slave trade would not have been possible. African intermediaries supplied the vast majority of captives, negotiating directly with Europeans at coastal outposts. Some leaders, like the kings of Dahomey, even institutionalized the trade, conducting large-scale raids to maintain steady supplies for the foreign ships. But this cooperation came at a cost far greater than many realized. Entire regions were destabilized as wars and raids intensified. Communities lost generations of young men and women. Traditional structures of society frayed under the pressure of violence and fear. What began as transactions between kingdoms and foreign merchants gradually hollowed out entire societies, leaving scars that remain visible even today. Not all African leaders accepted this system. Some resisted, writing letters to European monarchs, pleading for the trade to end because of the devastation it caused among their people. Others attempted to block traders or punish those who participated. Yet the lure of foreign goods, and the growing dependence on European weapons, proved difficult to resist. For every leader who opposed the trade, another saw it as a means of survival or dominance. The legacy of these choices is complex. It challenges the notion of clear villains and victims, revealing instead a tangled web of power, greed, and survival. While Europeans created and sustained the global market that drove the transatlantic trade, African rulers and merchants played roles that cannot be ignored. They were not powerless, nor were they equal partners. They were participants in a system that ultimately consumed their own societies. To understand this history is to recognize its painful truths. Cooperation in the trade does not lessen the brutality of European exploitation, nor does it erase the resilience of those who resisted. But it does remind us that history is rarely simple. The story of the Atlantic trade was not only a clash between continents, it was also a tragedy that unfolded within Africa itself, as neighbors turned against neighbors and short-term gain gave way to long-term devastation. When we reflect on these events, we see the weight of decisions made centuries ago. Choices driven by rivalry, ambition, or desperation helped feed one of the largest forced migrations in human history. And yet, even in the midst of betrayal and loss, cultures endured. Songs, languages, and traditions crossed the ocean, carried by those who survived. This chapter of history is not just about what Europeans did to Africa, it is also about the divisions and decisions within Africa that made the trade possible. It is a story of complicity and consequence, of power and its price, and of a world forever changed by the bargains struck on distant shores. In the wake of centuries of transatlantic trade, Africa was left profoundly altered. What began as exchanges of people for goods grew into a force so powerful that it reshaped entire societies. The effects were not confined to the shores where ships departed or the forts where captives were held, they rippled across villages, kingdoms, and generations, leaving scars that are still visible today. Imagine a once thriving community along the Niger River. Families tended fertile fields, artisans carved wood and shaped iron, elders preserved oral histories, and children played in open courtyards. When raiding parties struck, the heart of the community was torn apart. With each abduction, not only were lives stolen but entire family lines disrupted. The absence of so many left villages hollow, unable to sustain the balance of work, tradition, and continuity. Over decades, this drain of human life devastated populations, with some regions losing a third or more of their people. Beyond the immediate loss of life came something more insidious, the erasure of memory and culture. Those who were taken carried their songs, languages, and spiritual practices across the ocean, but in the Americas they were often forbidden to speak their native tongues or honor their ancestral traditions. Over time, countless cultural threads were cut. What survived did so through quiet resistance, stories whispered at night, rhythms hidden in drums, or customs blended into new forms. Africa's diversity was diminished not only by numbers but by the silencing of voices. Back on the continent, the trade destabilized kingdoms and altered the very fabric of power. Societies once built on farming, crafts, and trade were now redirected toward capturing and selling people. Some kingdoms rose briefly in wealth and strength, only to collapse when the trade shifted elsewhere or when the violence they unleashed turned back upon them. Communities that resisted the trade often faced relentless attacks, leaving them vulnerable to conquest. This constant cycle of fear and instability fractured unity and stunted development for centuries. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the labor of millions built vast wealth for others. Plantations in the Caribbean, Brazil, and the American South produced sugar, coffee, tobacco, and cotton that fueled the rise of European empires. The prosperity of ports like Liverpool, Nantes, and Lisbon was rooted in suffering oceans away. Entire economic systems were created on the backs of those forced into labor, while Africa bore the cost of depopulation and destruction. Perhaps the most enduring consequence, however, was the construction of a social order based on race. In order to justify this system, colonizers and traders promoted the belief that people from Africa were lesser, their identities reduced to commodities. These ideas hardened into laws, customs, and hierarchies that persisted long after the ship stopped sailing. What began as economic exploitation evolved into entrenched systems of inequality, shaping how societies across the globe viewed and treated people of African descent. Even after the trade officially ended in the 19th century, its legacy remained. Entire generations in Africa had been lost, economies destabilized, and cultures fractured. In the Americas and Europe, wealth and power built from this exploitation created divides that still echo in the modern world. Racial hierarchies established during those centuries became embedded in institutions, influencing politics, economies, and social structures in ways that continue to affect lives today. This history is not simply about the past, it is about the present. The forced movement of millions of people was not only a human tragedy but also a reshaping of the global order. The music we hear, the languages we speak, the borders that divide nations, and the inequalities we witness are all tied in some way to this long and painful chapter. Yet within this story of devastation lies another story, one of resilience. Despite attempts to erase their heritage, people of African descent preserved fragments of culture that grew into new traditions. Spirituals became the roots of gospel and blues. Stories told in secret became part of the cultural fabric of new nations. Communities rebuilt themselves time and again, finding strength in survival. To look back is not to dwell on sorrow, but to recognize how the past has shaped us and to honor those who endured. The deaths were countless, the erasures profound, and the hierarchies enduring, but so too was the determination of those who refused to be defined by chains or silenced by oppression. Their resilience is the thread that binds the past to the present, reminding us that even in the darkest chapters of history, the human spirit finds ways to endure and to create. The trade left a legacy of loss, but also of survival. Understanding its impact allows us to see more clearly the roots of today's inequalities and to acknowledge the strength of those who lived through it. Only by telling this story honestly, with all its complexity, can we honor the lives it touched and ensure that its lessons are never forgotten. Centuries have passed since the last ship crossed the Atlantic with its human cargo, yet the memory of those journeys lingers like an echo that refuses to fade. Across continents, memorials stand, textbooks recount the events, and descendants continue to carry the weight of a past that reshaped the world. The Atlantic trade was not a distant incident confined to dusty archives, it was a turning point that changed the destinies of nations, families, and entire civilizations. In recent decades, governments, institutions, and religious organizations have begun to confront this painful history. Some nations have offered public apologies, acknowledging their role in perpetuating a system that tore millions from their homes. Ceremonies have been held at ports once used as departure points, where bells toll and flowers are cast into the sea in remembrance. These gestures are important, for they symbolize recognition after centuries of silence. Yet, recognition alone cannot undo the consequences. The question of reparations, whether financial, cultural, or institutional, remains deeply debated. Supporters argue that the immense wealth created during those centuries was built on exploitation, and that justice demands restitution. Opponents counter with the complexity of tracing accountability across generations. And so, the debate continues, reflecting how the past is not as distant as it may seem. But while policies and governments wrestle with answers, the human truth is undeniable: the Atlantic trade stands as one of the greatest human tragedies in history. Its legacy is not measured only in numbers but in silenced voices, shattered communities, and the endurance of inequality that still echoes today. To acknowledge this truth is not about blame, it is about understanding the cost of forgetting, and the responsibility of remembering. Despite the immense sorrow tied to this history, there is also a story of survival. Across the Americas, in the Caribbean, in Brazil, and in countless other places, the descendants of those who endured have built vibrant cultures. Music, cuisine, faith, and traditions born out of resilience testify to the fact that even when stripped of everything, the human spirit can create, adapt, and thrive. This legacy of survival is just as important as the legacy of loss. To tell this story is to hold both truths at once, the tragedy of what was taken, and the strength of what was preserved. It is a reminder that history is not just a record of the past, but a mirror reflecting the world we live in now. When we recognize the depth of this history, we also recognize the resilience of those who lived it and the responsibility we have to build a more just future. And so, as we close this chapter, let us not leave it behind as if it were only words in a book. Let it inspire reflection, empathy, and the courage to ask difficult questions about our world today. The Atlantic trade may have ended centuries ago, but its lessons remain urgent. To honor those who were lost, and those who endured, we must continue to tell their stories and ensure their voices are never silenced again. If you found this journey meaningful, I invite you to be part of our growing community. Please like this video to help share these stories, subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next chapter, and share this with others who value history told with honesty and heart. Together, we can keep the memory alive and ensure the resilience of the past continues to inspire the future.